interviewing the leading private equity executives and unlocking the secrets of success. Welcome to the Private Equity Podcast with Alex Rawlings.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Private Equity Podcast. If you have not already, please do subscribe, as we put out podcasts every 2 weeks, and you'll be notified of them straight into your inbox. Joining us today is Daniele D'Alvia, CEO and founder of SPAC's Consultancy. Welcome and thank you for joining us and sharing your insights today.
Thanks for having me.
So Daniele, for those of us that don't know you, could you give us a kind of 60 to 90 second breakdown of you, please?
Thanks. I am a corporate finance lawyer, and since 2018, I set up SPAC's Consultancy, where we advise management of SPACs and also, of course, underwriters and all the main actors that are involved in the SPAC transactions. I am also an academic, so a teaching fellow in banking and finance at Queen Mary University of London. And there I have researched SPACs for more than 10 years. And just in November 2021, there will be, after almost 10 years of writing, my first book on SPACs. That is also the first book in the world, that is titled Mergers, Acquisitions, and International Financial Regulation, Analyzing Special Purpose Acquisition Companies, edited by Routledge.
Excellent, excellent. So what's one mistake do you see either private equity firms or their portfolio companies making, Daniele?
Well, actually, Alex, I would think rather than speaking of mistakes, speaking of opportunities. So we always learn from mistakes, and we have to even highlight that private equity industry had a quick rebound. In fact, if we see one of the last reports of private equity market report by Bain & Company in March 2021, we discovered that actually in the second half of 2020, private equity industry did very well. What for sure, are two key points that could be highlighted as possible areas where mistakes are made are the valuations. So the fact that there was in 2020 and also today in 2021, we see always a growing interest in technology firms where asset prices are soaring. So in some way, it's very important the valuation process, and that can give room for error or mistakes. And on the other hand, the private equity industry has been historically, at least for too long, a paper-driven industry. And so this, the pandemic, I think, has shown how this could be inefficient and can create some mistakes.
Okay, interesting. And for those listening and maybe not as fully up to speed, as I appreciate the SPAC space has been around for a very long time, but I also appreciate that it hasn't been quite as mainstream certainly it has been over the last few years. Can you describe that kind of space for us and the definition of a SPAC and how that works, please?
Thanks. Yes, actually, I have to say, starting that there is not a real definition of a SPAC. And also from a legal point of view, we don't have a legal definition of SPACs unless, in Malaysia, we have soft law instruments like the guidelines, equity guidelines, where there is a forced definition of SPACs. SPACs actually are investment vehicles, are cash shell vehicles, so they are non-operating companies, where the management, that are usually high expert managers, they look for a target company to acquire, usually by virtue of a reverse takeover. So it means that then after the process is completed, the target company, that is a private company, becomes public. And to this end, just to summarize, we can say that SPACs, they reverse the IPO process. So instead of an operating company seeking investors, we have investors that they seek an operating company.
Okay, that definitely makes sense. Why do you think that SPACs have become so popular over the last few years?
Well, I think that there was already in the market some conditions that they were created. In fact, for example, there was a long decline in the appetite for traditional IPO. And so if we think even in 1996, the number of public companies today is half of what was in 1996. So for this reason, IPOs were down 85% since then. And this has created already a room to have like a SPAC growth. But definitely the pandemic has been a key element because interest rates, for example, they started to become lower on debt. And so this has shifted the interest of investors to equity. And SPACs, of course, they fill this gap. They fill the gap where investors, they can invest in equity, and even for the first time, retail investors, they can bet on target companies that are high growth companies. So they can bet who is the next Tesla, for example, something that traditionally was reserved only for institutional investors, especially in venture capital round of financing.
Yeah, I agree. I think certainly within private equity, I think there's an issue there where the only people that can really get in is institutional. I know there's a little bit of, I've spoken to a few people on the podcast that are looking to change a little bit of that, but fundamentally not a lot can be advertised and published and promoted. And it can be quite a secular industry on that basis where it has to come from institutional capital, and therefore as normal retail investors potentially don't get the opportunity to invest, albeit I hope that does change and continues to private equity continues on its kind of route of becoming more of a mainstream type investment vehicle. So looking at the private equity world and SPAC, I mean, if you look at them on the outset, you would suggest that they're most likely competitors in essence, with SPAC being a slightly different model than private equity and more singular rather than typically in a private equity model, there'll be multiple acquisitions. So what kind of threats and opportunities do you believe that the SPAC industry presents to the private equity industry?
For sure, I think, as you said, there are key differences. So the fact is that private equity industry has highly relied on debt. So here in the private equity industry, we can say in a nutshell, debt is key, while in SPACs, equity is key. So warrants and shares, stocks. So we are speaking about two different worlds, at least at a first sight. But then if we delve into this kind of paradigm, we start to see that actually many private equity firms since the start of the SPAC boom in 2020, they started to be on the sponsor side. So for example, Gorse Group and the TPG, they just issued 11 SPACs for 4.82 billion of proceedings. And then also Apollo that raised 1.45 billion with 3 SPACs, for example, between 2020 and 2021. But private equity firms are also active sellers, so they look for exit strategies. And just to mention maybe one of the biggest deals of 2020 is the famous transaction with Blackstone and CVC that took PaySafe public in a 9 billion deal.
Interesting. So there's definitely a lot of opportunity there. What do you think, obviously with the SPAC industry being what you would regard as a newer in the mainstream of investing, what do you think private equity can learn from what the SPAC industry is doing?
I think that private equity can learn that the SPAC transaction, they can be an alternative way for their exit strategies, but also for their ways of investing, as we were saying before. But generally, I mean, I think that SPACs are an alternative way of investments. So this is something that actually, more than learning, I think that private equity industry and SPACs in the future, they will start to become closer. because the opportunities in the future will be more on equity than debt.
Okay, interesting. So, and what do you, obviously being on the periphery, as I would suggest, might be like myself with regards to private equity, you know, we're not actively investors ourselves, but what do you kind of love about the private equity or kind of venture capital industry, and also what do you dislike about it?
Yeah, well, what I said even before at the start is the fact that, I mean, in a period of disruption, economic crisis, the private equity industry has always a way to soar, so a way to come back and not to go down. So this is something that, I mean, is the challenging feature of private equity, and it is what I love. They are creative. So even if, I don't know, in the 1980s, everything was more on the leverage buyout, then once they saw a new opportunity in SPACs, they started to become sponsors in SPACs or to use SPACs for their exit strategies. So they always find a way, and this is something that is very challenging, interesting, competitive. On the other hand, something that maybe I can say I dislike about private equity, that I don't really dislike something, but the fact is that, of course, if you rely, for example, on debt, as we know, is an amplifier. So like if you buy companies in period that are positive periods of economic downturn, for sure you have multiples, for sure you have high profits, returns. But of course, if you use that to buy companies in a period of crisis, and then maybe you over-evaluate assets, this can be challenging, because then everything that is a loss became 3 times more. So the return on equity for private equity investors in period of crisis, and with maybe mistakes that we were saying at the start in terms of valuations that are made by managers, that can be paid highly, more than stocks, than when you invest in stocks, of course.
Okay. And what would you, I appreciate learning about SPACs and being in that world, but what are your influences? What do you read? What do you watch? What do you listen? Where do you take your learning points from?
Yeah, reading, I mean, I always read the Financial Times, then I'm Italian, so I read Milano Finanza, Sole 24 Ore, and the Wall Street Journal. And of course, Bloomberg. Bloomberg always, I mean, I subscribe to different updates. So it's something that is important if you work or in general, even as an academic, if you research in financial markets. On the other hand, for example, to listen, I like also exchanges at Goldman Sachs, that they have a specific podcast about financial markets. And apart from financial, I mean, matters or topics, I like also to read classics like Dostoevsky. So I think that, I mean, managers or generally also academics in financial markets, they always should have an open mind. So not only focus on finance, but also to philosophy and to other type of topics.
Okay, and if someone's listening and wants to find out a bit more about the SPAC industry, where would you recommend that they went to kind of read up on that and research it?
For sure, SPAC Insider. Then for sure my papers or the papers of Professor Milos Vulanovic, who is one of the major experts in SPACs in economics. And then, of course, as I said at the start, I have now published in November 2021 the first book on SPACs, and I have other 2 edited collections on SPACs in the pipeline. So I think very soon the market, the reading market, I mean, can be covered.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. And Danny, if anybody wants to reach out to you and maybe have a bit of a discussion either about your firm or further discuss the SPAC industry and how that affects private equity, how best does somebody reach out to you, please?
For sure, we have a website, SPACconsultancy.com, but also my email, that is d.dalvia@spacsconsultancy.co.uk.
Okay, perfect. We'll put that all in the show notes if anybody wants to reach out. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Daniel. I really appreciate your insight and brought lots of value for everybody listening, and a bit of a learning curve as well for me, understanding more about the SPAC industry. So thank you very much for that. And as of course, those listening, thank you very much for joining us. And should you ever need support with either private equity professionals or portfolio executive hiring, please do reach out to me and Raw Selection in the future. And of course, please do subscribe and you'll be notified of the next podcast coming out in 2 weeks. But till then, keep smashing it. And thank you very much for listening.
Thank you for listening to the Private Equity Podcast on www.raw-selection.com.